Folks are coming in. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Hi, Steve. Hi, Kathy. We're gonna let a few moments pass here and make sure, hi, Katie, make sure we've got all the folks in the door that want to come in. I'm assuming you all got a prompt letting you know that we are recording this. We are going to be recording this. And we're going to be putting it up on YouTube in order for folks who couldn't attend today to maybe be able to attend the recorded version and get some of their similar questions answered. Hi, Tanya. Welcome. All right, I think we'll just let people come, if that works, come in as they roll in. I'll start off by saying I'm Dawn Smallman. I'm the Grants and Programs Coordinator at Oregon Humanities. I'd like to introduce my two colleagues. Leslie Bennett, the CFO of Oregon Humanities, is here with us today. Thank you, Leslie, for joining us. And Lucy Solares-Steger, the Oregon Humanities Program Assistant, is also joining us. Thank you for coming, Lucy. And to let folks kind of know the work that we do, Lucy and I are on the side of administering the grants. And Leslie is obviously, as the CFO, on the financial side of the organization. So budget questions will be in Leslie's realm because she's the expert, and then helping you guys understand whether you're trying to make a decision about whether to apply, your eligibility, whether you should be going for the general operating or the project support grant types, things like that. Anything that you have questions about, whether what you're applying for is a approved eligible activity or if it's not one, that kind of stuff Lucy and I can talk to you about. But we're open for all questions. So does somebody have a first question they'd like to lob our way? Feel free to unmute.
Okay, my name's Kathy Skelly and I'm in Florence. And I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Are you ready? Oh, okay. I didn't know if you could hear me yet.
Yeah, it's just an informal conversation today, so all questions welcome.
So I'm on the part at the bottom of the grant where it says grant budget. And when I'm filling that out, it's got revenue and expenses. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it. So we put the request that we want from Oregon Humanities, and then some of it's pretty basic, like the individual support, the corporate support, but then we're applying for a general operating support, not a project one, because we have written some other grants this year and got money for a big project that we're working on, and we were lucky enough to be granted. But what we need is some technical support, to buy a person to help us with installing all the new equipment. And so do I put under foundation support, the other foundations that we were granted, do I put that money in there, or is that zero because we're not using that money for the general operating?
Okay, I can answer that. First of all, Kathy, there's two different templates. So make sure that you've downloaded the one that says general operating. And the general operating grant supports the entire organization. You can internally decide how to spend the funds. So, but the budget for a general operating grant is the entire organizational budget, not just what you've internally decided to use the funds on.
Even under the part where it says grant budget? Because when I know I have to do the, I have to upload the 2021 board approved budget.
Right. So it said it should hopefully say general operating support budget. Is that the one that you are looking at?
I'm in the title of the grant that I'm applying for is the COVID-19 Emergency Sharp General Operating Support Grant.
Great. Good.
Right. And
yes.
Within the portal, as you're going down and you've done all your narratives, and now you're down to the part where you've done your narratives and they're asking how, and I've uploaded signature things, the 501c3, the board approved budget. And then at the very bottom, there's the grant budget. So that's where I was confused, is it says, please complete this budget worksheet to show how the organization will use the SHARP funds. So it seems like it's very, the asking for what we're going to do with the money, right?
Right. And I think that might be a little misleading. So if you could please complete that general operating grant budget for the time period of the grant. Which
Okay,
might be different than your board approved budget, depending on your fiscal year.
Right. So then when we see the revenue, so it's divided into revenues and expenses. So on that section that says foundation support, we did get some money from other foundations for this other project. I didn't know if I include that in there, the other monies that we received, since we're not going to utilize it as general operating. I didn't know.
Right. Yeah. So the general operating literally means your entire organization, regardless if there's restricted funds or unrestricted funds. So what is your organization as a whole going to do during that time period for the general operating?
Okay. So let's say we got $10,000, or it's actually more than that, to upgrade all of our radio equipment. It's a big, huge, it's all the boards, the recording equipment, the computers, everything. And that was through a foundation. So do I put that amount of money where it's revenue?
Yes.
Because it's in our budget.
Yeah, as long as it's during this grant period. So this grant period, this budget would be all types of revenue, whether it's foundation, whether it's individual support for every project and for your entire organization. So yes, if it's in that time period that you've received that revenue, I would put that in there. Yes.
Okay, so I will do that. And then one more question about in-kind contributions. Can you kind of help me through that? I'm always a little bit like unsure. We do track our volunteer hours that we have monthly. And so I have a general idea of the number of volunteer hours. And so how do I calculate my in-kind contributions?
Sure. So in-kind contributions would be any service or material that you receive that your organization has not had to actually pay for. The trick with in-kind is you don't want to inflate your revenue with in-kind. There has to be a corresponding expense as well. So for example, like if I were to give my time as CFO to Oregon Humanities, I would show up as an expense, but I would also show up as in-kind contribution. So it needs to zero out, it balances out to zero. So if so you have this big project going on with maybe somebody gave you some microphones and they were worth $1,000. You would show that as $1,000 in kind revenue, but you would also have to show it then as $1,000 supply expense. In kind is a very specific thing because it quite literally needs to zero out to zero, net zero, at the bottom of a budget.
A lot of our in-kind, and this is my last question, I don't want to hog the whole thing, but a lot of our in-kind are like time with not so much items, but it's time, because we're a community radio station. So it's volunteering hours to write grants, you know, because we only have one part-time paid employee. So everything else that gets done, everything is done by volunteers and board.
And do you provide the volunteers with any notification that they've donated their time to you, or they just come in and out? Or do you give them some type of statement at the end of the year?
They give me their hours for the month. So I kind of keep track of the hours that people have put in through the month, but we don't give them anything. So I don't even know if we're doing it correctly.
Right. So you're not applying any type of charge or level of expense to it. So I think in the short term, you probably want to leave that off this particular budget. But I think what you want to do is think about that long term for your organization of how you can value in-kind time. Again, with remembering that it has to have a net sum of zero.
Okay. I
So
just didn't want to
often,
go ahead.
yeah, often what I do is if you have somebody that is giving you their time, then they set the value of what their time is often, particularly if they're, a professional providing services
Right.
to you. And then you would show that as in-kind contribution. And then under professional services would be where you would put the expense.
Okay. And so can I do that? I mean, can I, let's see, going forward, I think we should maybe make it more formalized, but right now I just have a general amount of hours that people have put in. Could I
If
just use,
if there's a way for you to value it, then yes.
Yeah.
But just make sure that you also show it as an expense. It should not show it as just revenue. It goes on both sides.
and that's what was happening. I thought, well, geez, that's inflating it because it looks like we've got, okay. But I
Right.
didn't want to be seen as, I don't want the Oregon Humanities to feel like we're not doing our part, with volunteering and all that,
Sure. And you can also, as you're talking about your organization in the grant proposal, you can mention those types of things, of course. Not every organization receives in-kind contributions, so don't feel left out if you don't.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Kathy. We left an open-ended question at the end of the grant is there anything else that you'd like to tell our reviewing committee? So that would be a good place if you want to add that additional point. You're more than welcome to add that there. The other thing I would just say there's been a few community radio stations that have reached out to me, and in general, there's been a large question for lots of organizations about whether they're more appropriate in the general operating or they're more appropriate in the project support, the two branches, the two types of grants. And one thing I would caution everybody is that in both types of grants, there is a restriction. We cannot fund the making of or performance of art. So I know I talked to one community radio station recently who had heavy music programming. And so we kind of strategically shared a conversation about whether it would be wiser for them to be in the project program type grant rather than the general operating. So I think if you're going in general operating, just be aware of the fact that none of the activities that you could use the funds for if you receive those funds could go to funding any of your music programs, because that would be the performance of art, or if you had any in studio like live music performances, it could not go towards that, just so you know.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in with a question?
Yeah, I had one. So going back to under expenses in the grant budget, there is one section called ADA access. And can you clarify what that is or what that looks like?
Yeah, the American Disabilities Act access. So if you have any kind of work that falls under that kind of work, you could put that in there. Any kind of cost that falls under that kind of work. So if you had an ASL translator at your events, that could fall under there. If you had captioning that you were doing for any kind of online events, that could fall under there. Things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question.
I had a question about, my name is Tanya. I'm coming from Milagro, so we're a theater, but so we're going for more of the project grant. And I just wanted to clarify whether one of the projects that we've been looking at could be funded. So we're looking at doing a Latino oral history project, as well as a documentary about the history of the programming that we have done. And we just wanted to know if those things, like you said, were considered part of making our production of art, or if as the way we're using it is more of a archival kind of recording of history type of thing. So just getting clarification about our eligibility with that.
Sure, thank you, Tanya. I think the documentary that is, so part of it is, it's a fuzzy line between what is art and what is culture, and it's one that we navigate all the time, and I'm sure you do too. So I think if your interested in those two projects. One of them seems much more firmly centered in humanities work, and that is the oral history project. The documentary project, I think, could be seen as art. So I think if you're choosing between which of the two for the project grant, I would say the oral history. And then the other thing that you could do, in terms, I know just a snapshot from your description, but you mentioned the word archive. I think, including the oral history as an archive and mentioning it that way would be really wise and position you well. And then also any kind of archives that are open to the public is one of the key. There's a section in both of the grant types of a summary, and folks should, I hope, read that summary. It's kind of a tedious list of restricted and approved activities for awards. And so collections that aren't open to the public are kind of frowned upon and listed as a restricted activity for funding. So make sure you mention that the oral histories that you're collecting, if they're going into an archive, will be open to the public and accessible, and give us a picture of how they'll be useful to the community. I think that would be a project that would be firmly and positively eligible for this kind of funding.
Okay, thank you. I just had one more question. And this is more also clarifying. I was at another info session with you, and for the project grants, I think, I don't know who it was that mentioned it could be like multiple projects as part of like humanities programming that we're doing. So if we wanted to include descriptions on the oral history project, or like workshops and panels that we're doing in conjunction with our productions here. So I just wanted to clarify on that. Maybe I'm wrong, but when we do the project grants, we could potentially be supported in multiple of our humanities focused projects.
Yes, you could do it for more than one. I think you would be wise to do it, most wise to do it for one, for a single one. I think the worry if somebody puts in the application with multiple projects is then it's starting to look like it's general operating support of what you're asking for if you're asking to cover a number of projects. So in terms of like, yes, it's legal for you to make the request, but is it wise? So it's a two-part question, I think. And I think the wisest thing if you're applying for the project grant is to focus on a single project probably, but it is allowed that you could do more than one. I would caution you against doing more than two for sure. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Anyone else have a question?
Hi, yeah, I have a question really quickly. So I had spoken with you yesterday, Dawn, just a little bit about some of the programming at the school that was interested in applying. And after talking with them yesterday, we were considering utilizing the project funds for after school programming. And during after school programming time, it's really focused on kind of one-on-one homework sessions for the Spanish section of the academic. It's like homework session time for Spanish speaking students. And then it's primarily focused on like cultural arts and enrichment activities. So we were considering what they offer right now is a cultural heritage and arts club, but we were considering expanding that and offering things like muse bands, ballet, folklorico, as well as some artist residencies that would also be culturally specific. And so I was curious if we were able to, if that would fall under the realm of the humanities and would qualify.
I think that you and I were, if I'm remembering properly, you and I were talking more about a literacy program, right? A linguistics program first originally.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more firmly centered in the humanities work for sure. Again, the arts and culture question is so I'll give you some background. The funding for the SHARP grants that comes to us comes through the National Endowment of Humanities. There is another line of funding that comes from the federal government through the National Endowment for the Arts, and that ends up in Oregon at the Oregon Arts Commission. And so they're the ones who are granting out the arts money. So that's why there's restrictions in our SHARP grants against the funding of the making or performance of art. Obviously, when you're getting into art that is culturally relevant and traditional culture bearers, passing down traditional arts and culture to next generation and things like that. That's more rooted in humanities, obviously. So I think that would be more in the funding. I would caution you or encourage you when you're writing it to write it very carefully, to not be talking primarily about arts, to be talking more about cultural traditions being passed down by culture bearers to through intergenerational activities after school with the kids in the program, things like that. Just so there's nobody on the reviewing committee who's gonna, know that restriction against funding the making or performance of art and think that you're proposing doing that. So just be very careful with your wording and make sure it's aimed towards cultural traditions, the teaching of cultural traditions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that. And then the second question I had just was in regards to some of the COVID particular questions on there. So I think I mentioned this as well, but many of the families who send their students to our school are low-income families and were greatly affected by COVID. And so that made quite the financial impact on the school, just because, I mean, I think it's pretty much less than 5% of their families were actually able to pay tuition. And so they ended up having to cover the rest of that. And so that's the primary financial impact. However, especially when it comes to these cultural enrichment activities after school, how the school views it as recovering is the mental health aspect of helping the kids recover. And there's been huge mental health effects on children, especially in schools because of the COVID pandemic. So I was curious if that was kind of an acceptable form of an answer, or if it really needs to be directly related to the funding aspect of it,
Well,
of like how we would recover from that.
I think you should definitely cover some thoughts. I think covering the financial impact
Mm-hmm.
and the financial resilience that if you receive funding that you would get, and also what you're saying I think is totally legitimate, that the funds that you're requesting are through a cultural program that also enriches the youth and supports mental health at a precarious time where we're all feeling the mental health effects of COVID. I think that's totally legit, but I would not just put in the mental health stuff without also making the point about the financial and operational impacts too, because that's one of the judging criteria is has the applicant clearly demonstrated the financial and operational impacts. That's why we gave you check boxes in the grant for you, so you to aim you towards forcing you to basically tell us some of that. But I think it's good to elaborate a little bit more. The loss of the enrollment income is a perfect example. So
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I think that's it when it comes to the questions I have. Thank you.
okay, thanks, Morgan. It's actually great to be putting faces to the voices I've been hearing over the phone too. Thanks for coming. Anybody have another question?
I have a couple of questions. Dawn, we exchanged emails, so here's a voice with text.
Yeah, hi, Steve.
I'm Steve Williamson. I'm on the board of the Singing Creek Educational Center in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and we do all kinds of camps and programs for kids and families. We've just started partnering with Spanish-speaking groups and Guatemalan groups in Cottage Grove. But the question, COVID has really slammed our ability to offer programs because they're all in person. They're, all the kids are together, the grandparents are together. And so so it sounds to me like operating expenses would be where we would fall in, because COVID's just had a devastating effect on our programs. And in the operating expenses, I get the general operating expenses of, the telephone and insurance costs. Let me ask you about this. Suppose we want to do a new position of, right now we only have one part-time person, our executive director, Karen Rainsong. But how about paying for a development specialist, someone to help write grants and do fundraising for these projects and for these programs and projects that we're not able to do right now? Would the funding of a development specialist fall under this grant?
I'm sorry to say that there is a restriction, and all these restrictions that we have for this grant are written by the NEH, and there is a restriction against fundraising activities. So I think that would be a no-go under this grant. I think, though, to answer partially a yes to your question, you could fund the salary for a new person to help expand your program. That would be a new person, a new addition would be allowable. But to have the addition be somebody who's working on fundraising, I think would in particular would be ineligible.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry to give you that news, but maybe you can reframe it and think of some other needs that you have with a new position, and that could work for you. If you have follow-up questions too, you're welcome. Everybody's welcome to email me after we're done here today. Did you have more questions, Steve, or was that it?
Let's see. I have another. Just to go over this, unless other people have something to want to jump in on it. When we were emailing, it was we have that mentoring relationship with this fledgling group in Cottage Grove that where our executive director is helping their director learn how to put together a nonprofit in Cottage Grove. And so from our communications, we're going to have a real big firewall between that and any of the other activities that we do, because I saw in the grant that we're acting as a fiscal agent. Right. And that's a relationship. I've wanted all my career to see mentorships available, and Singing Creek has a great executive director who's a great mentor to fledgling directors. And so, but yeah, we'll put up a real firewall there. So
that's great. Yeah. I mean, if you're not asking for financial support for those activities to mentor that fiscally sponsored entity, then it's just not an issue for us. So I wouldn't even include anything about it in the application. If you're not asking for the funding to cover it, you should be in the clear.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. Who's up next?
I have a question, but at risk of repeating a question that's already been asked, so I'm really sorry about that. I just want to make sure that I understand the grant budget issues. So just for context, I am working with the Beaverton Downtown Association, and we're a historic preservation and community development organization. And during COVID, we lost our we had an office that kind of served as a central gathering point, and we'd like to apply for funds to get that back and then use that as a space also to serve other people in the community, with a couple other organizations bought in on that as well. So for the grant budget for general operating support, that is just essentially our operating budget for the grant timeline. It's not just specifically for like what that money would be going towards, which would exclusively be rent in our case. Is that true? Or?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
It's your entire organization for the grant period time.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
You're
repeating
welcome.
that. I just want to make sure.
Sure.
Katie, I'd be sure to mention in your application that what you're proposing to do supports additional community organizations too, right? And none of those, I'm assuming none of those are like fiscal sponsored kind of arrangements.
No,
those are just partnerships. I think that you'd be really smart to mention that specifically, especially it sounded like when we talked on the phone, some of it was serving to typically historically underserved groups and things like that. So I would definitely encourage you to include that in your application.
great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for attending. Do you have more questions or?
That was it. I just wanted to make sure. The first question, of course, right off the bat kind of hit at what I was most interested in.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Who's next? Anybody have any questions about how to strategically frame a certain answer, or?
I'll go ahead with one more.
Sure.
This is the question of the arts. Some of our programs, like they have kids do arts and crafts that they might do in Guatemala, or a kid 100 years ago in Guatemala, or a kid in Oregon 100 years ago. Is making a corn dolly considered art? Corn dolly.
I like that question. These are questions that we're talking a lot about on a regular basis at our office too, right? And the basic way the answer typically breaks down is if it's just general folks getting together and making art with a general art teacher, then that doesn't fall in our mind under the humanities umbrella as much. It doesn't fall under the humanities umbrella. What falls under the humanities umbrella is when you have a person from a culture who's teaching a traditional art and passing it down intergenerationally or within their generation, or explaining it to the public as a cultural immersion program, things like that. So a lot of it has to do with what kind of art it is, and if it's an art that's a cornerstone of a traditional culture. So I'm assuming, I don't know that much about traditional Guatemalan art, but I'm assuming the kind of activity that you're describing is one of those traditional arts, and if so, then that would qualify. Again, I would make sure that when you're writing about that, if you're asking for funding, that you're being careful not to talk about arts and artists and art making, but you're talking about traditional culture bearers with cultural knowledge of craft, demonstrating the craft in order to, further the culture to the kids in the program.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. That's good. That's a good clarification, because our art things they have history and culture built into them. We're not doing art for art's sake, but yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yep. And we're just trying to be, we need to be true to the restrictions that we get from the federal, from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we're only using their funds appropriately as they see it. So we go through an audit and they make sure that we're holding to the restrictions that they've given us. So that's how we're encountering that art versus culture question a lot with this one, because of that restrictions in there. So appreciate the discussion and the understanding around it. Anyone else?
I had one more question. I'm Kathy. I spoke earlier about the budget. When I was speaking specifically about the in-kind donations, and she said maybe I shouldn't include that this time, and she was saying about zeroing out, everything has to zero out. Does she mean, Leslie, did you mean at the bottom, the very last thing when it says your net, the revenue versus expenses, that has to be zero? Like it?
Just that any revenue that's in kind has to have a corresponding expense of equal amount in your.
Okay. And since I don't really where I know the value of what everybody did, I should just put a zero and not include that this time?
Well, I would suggest if you don't have a way to value it, I don't know how you would put a number to it.
Yeah.
But if you do have a number that you can, a value and a number that you put to it, you always with in kind have to show a corresponding expense so that it does not show as if, so, for example, when you receive revenue, if something ends up in your bank account, right? And you pay an expense, it comes out of your bank account. If you don't do it in that way, then you will be out of balance.
Right.
And that's one of the requirements of in-kind revenue is to have the in-kind, have an expense that corresponds of the equal value, equal number.
So then on that same thing, so that other foundation, those other grants that we had written, that we were granted for, that were purchasing the equipment, the broadcasting equipment for it. So if I put the foundation money that we received, then I would have to show it in the equipment part. And it said that we couldn't have more than 20% equipment maximum 20% of the total grant. So I really, I would, I, Abel, I
Right,
don't
but
think,
the budget is about your organization during that time period as a whole. But
okay,
the restriction is about how you use the money specifically from Oregon Humanities. It's not
Okay.
about the budget, if that makes sense. So like, how are you going to, you take that money in and how are you going to write the checks out? There are some restrictions on how you write the, send that
Right.
out. But the budget itself should be your entire organization, like everything you're doing in that grant period.
okay. But I'm still I know that there's the annual budget for that whole grant period. But then the piece that's more, that you break it down more, the grant budget.
Right. That grant budget is your entire, or if you're doing a general operating request, is your entire organization. What are you going to do for your entire organization within that grant period? So like all the money you're going to bring in, regardless of what it's for, and all the money you're going to spend out in that grant period for your entire organization. It is not like the program budget, which is just about the money that you are going to spend from it.
That's confused me because it said that we couldn't have more than 20% of the equipment be the total grant, be
Right.
used on the total. Okay, I might have to
Can
call
I
and
hop
get-
in and say, yeah, that's the
Thank you.
restriction that we've gotten from the NEH. So if you're applying for the grant to cover any equipment, just make sure that the amount that you're applying for, say,
Dawn,
Oh, I lost you.
yeah, she's frozen. I think
costs to
Frozen.
exceed that percentage.
you cut out a little bit, Dawn.
Sorry. I'll try it again. Let's see if this works. So that's a restriction from the NEH. So if you're applying for, say, the $20,000 ask, you're applying for $20,000 for the grant. You
Okay,
just need to make sure that if you have any equipment that's part of your ask, it doesn't exceed that percentage of your ask.
okay, so we're not, okay. I think I'll get it. I may call someone later because I don't want to take up too much time. So, okay, thank you.
Kathy, just connect with me. Dawn, my name is Dawn Smallman. It's d.smallman, SMALLMAN, at OregonHumanities.org, and everybody's welcome to contact me through that email.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, we can work it out. We'll bat some numbers around and make it make sense for you. Okay, I had one.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, sorry. I hope I'm still not breaking up. Okay, good. I got a thumbs up from Lucy. Thanks, Lucy. So there's someone who's trying to get in and having trouble accessing, so they emailed me this question and I'm going to read it to you, Leslie. Let's see. The question is, hang on. Gotta get to it. May we include the cost of a rental of a meeting room large enough for a consultant board planning sessions that allows safe seating 6 to 10 feet apart? That seems like a legitimate use to me. Do you agree?
Yeah, is that for a program, I assume?
I think
Yep.
I think they're applying for Gen Op, actually.
Okay, so the general operating budget should be every piece of revenue and expense that an organization will have during that grant period, regardless if it reflects the funds from the NEH or not. But yes, that sounds like legitimate use of the funds. And it doesn't apply to any of the restrictions that I have seen from the NEH.
Great. I agree with that. Thank you very much.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly as well. So I think for our application would be applying for project support, but I understand that there's a portion of the application to attach our entire operating budget, but then there's a specific section within the application portal that would be dedicated just to the funding for the project itself, not the entire operational budget. Is that correct?
That's correct. So everyone will give a copy of their most recent board approved budget. So regardless of what type, if you're applying for project, then that budget is only about that project. So maybe it's maybe Oregon Humanities would be providing some funding for a portion of a project. So like say you have one big project, but you're quilting together lots of different funding to do it. It's about the project in that case. So, what are you going to do? What's the project that you're going to do? And that entire budget. And you'll see they look very similar, the budgets themselves, but it really depends on if you're doing general operating request. A general operating request is different than what you're talking about, which is the project request.
Mm-hmm. But I still have to attach, like, I thought that there was two portions there. So one was the board approved operating budget. And then the second portion is the like internal project budget provided by you guys for us to fill out.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
I have it right then, I think. Okay, thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Morgan. This is all good feedback for us too. Like hearing the confusion around this issue, I may go back after we wrap up here and make the language a little bit clearer, make it more user friendly. So I appreciate that you guys know that this is a dual purpose session. It's for us to learn from you as well about what we're getting right and what we could do better.
I had another question. We have applied for other grants, but have not received confirmation on those yet. Should those also be included in the grant budget when we fill that out? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would suggest yes. Like as you do at the beginning of the year, this is just a different example of something similar. So like, at the beginning of the year, when I put together a budget, we're not always sure if everything is going to come in or not, but you're making a budget of what's expected and what you really think will happen. And I think that's completely legitimate. Yes.
Thank you. And going with that, when you're talking about the timeline for the grant period, is that a specific set amount of time, or can you clarify what you mean by the grant period?
Yeah, the grant period, hang on 1 second. I'm going to look it up because it's not in my head. 1 second. Hang on. You know what? I have to look it up in an email. I thought I had it handy on my desktop. So if somebody else wants to ask a question while I'm looking that up, please move forward doing that. Okay, I have it here. The period of performance for sub-awardees, would be you all, if you received funding, should start no later than December 1st, 2021. And we're gonna wrap it up at the end of October, 2022. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful.
Glad I could find it. Got lots of notes about that.
I'm gonna pop right now in the not description, the chat, the link to this document that lives on our website, but it's kind of a bunch of text. And there's a timeline in there, so you can see the exact timeline that we were given by the NEH of the grant period.
Thank you for that, Lucy.
The school's fiscal year aligns that with like a typical school year, and so their operating budget is also aligned with that. So it begins in August and ends in June or so, or the following May. So does our overall budget need to be tailored to this specifically and start at the end of December and into October? Or is that just for the specific project that we would need to kind of calculate the funds for that? Because yeah, I guess I just imagine it might be a little tricky for us to separate some of that.
Sure. Excuse me. So if you're talking about the board approved budget that you have to provide a copy of, that's whatever your fiscal year happens to be.
Okay.
So that's fine. But yes, on the project budget, you would want it to be for that specific time period of December 1st, 2021 to October 31st of 2022.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Great.
Anyone else? We got about 15 minutes left. Don't be shy. Doesn't seem like more people are coming in, so feel free to use up the space.
Any general tips that you have for people just in writing their grants or just, yeah, advice?
I think the general advice I have is, I think the committee will be looking heavily at how much you've been impacted by COVID. And I know everybody has been. I think for organizations that have been impacted to the point where they're maybe walking the edge of not existing anymore, I know that there's been a lot of concern from organizations like that about how they'll be viewed if they kind of, provide transparency on that. Certainly reviewers always want to provide funds to organizations that they think are going to be around in the future. So if you're one of the organizations who's kind of walking that fine line, I would encourage you to be transparent with us about it, and then also kind of tell us a little bit more about what you're doing to ensure your future, that you're aimed right in the future. We want to be supportive of organizations who have been impacted, and certainly want to be supportive of organizations who are finding themselves in that situation. But I think it also just helps for reviewers to feel confident that they're providing money in a place where it won't just disappear with somebody folding. So if you find yourself in that situation and you'd like to talk to me more about that, connect with me individually online afterwards, and or offline, sorry, afterwards, and we can talk more about it. But if you feel like there's something that we're not giving you room for, I talked to one applicant yesterday who gave me feedback that they didn't like the 100-word restriction, and in order to be fair to people, I can't really waive that at this point, because we've had a number of applicants that have turned in their full applications. But if there's some other information that you'd like me to, something critical you feel like you can't fit into the grant, just contact me offline and we can talk about how to work that in properly. I think that the COVID impact will be huge, and I think also just the proposal of how you'll use the funds to make yourself more resilient, specifically in terms of COVID. Resiliency is also a really important thing. Community building is another big plus. Any of your history or anything that you're proposing to do that is community building and is building community resilience during times of COVID, I think would be a big plus as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. They're all great questions. I have a question for you all. Give us some feedback. What's the hardest part, or what's the most frustrating part about the application? And you can answer honestly.
I didn't really struggle with the application. We've already submitted it at this point. We ended up going with the general operations while we considered the project one. But we have so many different projects kind of going on throughout the calendar year that we're involved with, and so many community efforts that we felt it was best just to pursue general operations. I didn't have an issue. I've applied for, I've lost count of how many grants this year. We've cast a very wide net this year in the wake of COVID. So I think I've written over 30 grants this year alone. It definitely was not the most difficult one to fill out comparative to some of the other ones. And I appreciate the opportunity to go back and revise some things as well that we did put in. Sometimes because we ourselves, I'm Kurt Lidke. I run a nonprofit down in Klamath Falls that is very community based. And so we are oftentimes assisting other organizations in their events as well, providing technical support. So it's sometimes a little bit difficult to explain all that we actually do. So maybe that falls into what you were describing there as far as restriction, as far as detailing what an organization does if it isn't catered towards just one specific thing. We have our own activities as well, but on just about a weekly basis, we are in collaboration with other organizations. So sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to fully describe without a follow-up phone call or more opportunity to really detail everything that we're actually involved with and how funds do go to help out in all these different arenas, not just ourselves, but every organization that we are then by proxy helping out.
That makes sense. Thanks for that feedback, Kurt. I think we'll definitely think more in depth about putting the character word limit on to the grants in the future based on some feedback we're having this time. So I appreciate that.
I have another question. You mentioned that the grant period is actually from December through next October, but it doesn't align perfectly with our fiscal income and our fiscal calendar. So how do we calculate that?
Well, there's two budget pieces that you provide with this grant. One is just simply a copy of your most recent board approved budget. So that covers whatever your fiscal year might be. And then, and can you remind me, are you applying for the project grant or the general operating grant?
General operating.
Yeah. So what I would do is look at that same time period, perhaps maybe on a previous budget, and make some adjustments. And it's not for a full year, and apply a factor to it for
I
that
see.
shorter period of time.
Could
That
you
might be the
explain
easiest way to do
a
that.
little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So for example, if I have a budget, like I do my budgeting annually, right? Some organizations even do 2 or 3 years at a time, but generally speaking, we do annually. So we make the assumption you can take that information and break it down by month by simply dividing by 12, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's what I would do. And then you might have to make some adjustments if your organization has any seasonality to it.
Yes.
But I think something that's just pretty straightforward for your general operating budget, that's what I would do.
Okay. All right. That explains it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
This has been very helpful.
Great.
Great. I think this is something, these kind of online, this is our first time trying this. And it's been helpful, I think, for folks both times, the feedback we've been getting. And I think Oregon Humanities will likely continue this for our other grants as well. So, and maybe this is a good moment for me to check with you all and say, if you're not already signed up for our email list, I hope you'll go to our website and sign up for the email list. And you can sign up to receive all our information. But there's also an option where you can just click the grants box, so you can get just emails about upcoming grant opportunities. Because certainly we have more opportunities than this emergency SHARP funding. And also, just to put it all in your ear, we are having internal conversations about making some changes to some of our other grant types and what they would cover. So I can't say a bunch more than that because it's still conversations that are in the works. But keep your eyes open. If you get on that email list, you'll probably receive some news in the upcoming year about how we're restructuring certain things, and maybe get you some new opportunities or some different flavors of opportunities. Any other questions? We have 6 minutes left.
Well, this has been very helpful for me to hear other people's questions and get the questions I have answered. So I keep on doing these webinars because, yeah, these are really helpful, I think.
Thanks, Steve. Selfishly, I'd like to keep doing them so we can learn how we're serving you all and how we can better serve you all as we move forward, because certainly a lot of this is, information and language that gets handed down to us, and we try to translate it and make it accessible to everybody. And but we understand that it's still a lot of federal guidelines, restrictions, language, and things like that. And so making it more user-friendly is definitely something that we're always interested in doing. So I appreciate your feedback and coming to stuff like this, because it helps us help you. Any other last burning questions or not so burning questions? Okay, I think maybe we'll call it a few minutes early unless somebody wants to stop me.
I've always been curious. This is my second year as an executive director, so I'm still very much so learning the grant writing process. But it's definitely been a quantity approach this year, and I'm always a little paranoid. Being my day job is actually as a journalist, so I'm already paranoid I'm going to have like a bad typo in a headline that's just going to go viral or something. But if there's any like key trigger words or something that we should avoid at all cost in the course of an application that is an immediate death sentence to our application, if there's something that we should outright avoid, even though if it feels right in the flow of writing, if there's like blacklist words, like if that shows up in the course of a description, that automatically it's by default removed from further consideration. Does that come up in the course of consideration at all?
The only thing that I can think of in the case of the SHARP COVID grants with us, is anything that's on that restricted list of activities. So in the general operating, in the link on our website, you'll see general operating summary for the general operating support grant and a project summary for the project support grant. And there's a section called the approved and restricted activities for awards. And so if you were proposing to do anything that was on that restricted list, that would render you ineligible. So the one we've talked about and we've revisited a number of times today in this conversation is the making or performance of art. If you're proposing that and you turn in an application and that was included in your ask, or that's the work that your organization does primarily, then you would be ineligible. So things like that would be the things I would watch out for. But obviously any illegal activities would probably also be something that would not be looked at as eligible.
So even if we're an organization that does present cultural events from time to time, but the funds that we're requesting would not be going towards those said activities, because again, we're an organization that does all kinds of different things. Just the fact that we do some events that are arts and culture, but it's not the entire entity of what our operation does. Does that still fall under ineligibility at that point?
I think it's a bit of a judgment call, and I think part of and I know you and I were talking about this a little bit. It's a question, I think, about how best to position yourself. So, for example, I've talked to a number of theater groups, right? The performance of art, right? That's what they do, and they've been wanting to apply for general operating funds, but they're performance of art based. That's the totality or the majority of what they do. It's not everything of what they do. So I am strongly encouraging them to go to the project grant for that reason, because I think that there's a very good chance that when the review committee looks at their application, if they're under Gen Op, that they will be seen as ineligible. Even if they're not seen as ineligible, you can imagine that the review committee would probably be more likely to fund people who are in the main part of the stream of what is considered humanities, rather than people who are on the fringe edge of the shoreline, right? So I think it's a strategic question about for organizations who kind of have those multiple footings in multiple places. And I am encouraging folks who fall in that category to pick a program or a project that they think is firmly in the mainstream and to go for that, because I would hate to see anybody rendered ineligible or thought of as on the fringe edge of eligibility, which I think would not increase your chances of funding if you're on the fringe edge. I think we're going to have so many, and I already know that we have so many applicants who are going for this funding who are firmly humanities-centered organizations with humanities-focused 100% mission who are going for Gen Op, that I just naturally think that they will take the lead in terms of how they're getting scored. So that's why anybody who's applying for Gen Op who's not that, I am encouraging for them to think about the strategy of moving into the project program grants. And to Kurt's comment earlier about the ability to revise, as I'm seeing some folks come in, occasionally they've done something like uploaded their budget twice instead of uploading their budget and uploading the IRS determination letter. And so we've reached back out and said to people like, you have a chance to revise it and make that correction. If anybody wants to do that, or based on hearing more of the discussion today, wants to revise an answer to something they've already written and submitted or anything like that, just reach out to us. And earlier is better, because we're going to get really swamped. We're less than 10 days into our deadline here. So but if you want to revise something based on what you've heard in the discussion today, please reach out to me and we'll get you set up. Lucy will get you set up to be able to revise your application that way. We want to help you get to this funding. That's our goal. Our goal is to not knock you out as ineligible, or not to, our goal is to help you get best positioned to get yourself to this funding. And we just had someone new enter the room, so not to put the new folks on the spot, but if there's the new folks entering, we're actually 1 minute over now. So if there's a question that you have that you'd like to bring to the group, we'd welcome it. Any other last questions before we wrap it up? I think that's it then. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you being here today. Appreciate your time. Steve, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Did you say that this webinar would be available? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we'll put it up on Oregon Humanities YouTube channel. It may take us a day or two to do it, but we'll put it there for your reference.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for your work.
Thanks, everybody, for attending.